We're good.
We're good? All right.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for everyone for coming out here this evening. Thanks to Operation Flag the Lawn for inviting me to speak. I know there's a lot of people in this room who are probably a lot better qualified to talk about the military and being a veteran than I am, so I'll try to offer my particular perspective tonight. Thank you for UVA for the appreciation they've shown to veterans during my brief time here. Not very many schools were as generous with the new GI Bill as UVA was. And I'd like to thank the law school administration in particular for letting me in despite my horrible, horrible undergrad GPA. I've been told, not officially, but off the record, that it's the lowest of the incoming law students. Well, as Bobby just mentioned, and thanks to him as well, I think the Navy's going to be getting quite the asset when he graduates from UVA next year. As he mentioned, I just left active duty earlier this year after nearly 9 years spent in the Army. Most of the last 6 of which were spent in Iraq, Afghanistan, or in Europe, which is the last place that I was stationed. So this has really been a year of transition for me, from overseas to America, from being a full-time soldier to a full-time student, and from being a soldier to a veteran. And I'm just one of many that will be making this transition here in the near future. According to the Department of Labor, over 100,000 members of our military, men and women, will be leaving the military within the next 3 years. And we receive a lot of training these days when that happens, when we leave the military. We learn about building a resume, about looking for a job, about buying health insurance, about a lot of things that just aren't part of our daily lives in the military. But what we don't really talk about is how to make that last transition to becoming a veteran and how your identity changes during that time. So I'd like to speak to you for a little bit tonight. Don't want to go on too long. I'm sure everyone's got a nice full stomach like I do right now. But I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face in becoming a veteran, and to give non-veterans a look at the process and how they are such an important part of it going well. Now, when you're in the Army, and I apologize in advance to the other services for always using the Army as an example, it's just second nature at this point. But when you're in, everyone else around you, more or less, is in the military too. This is particularly true for people like me that are stationed at overseas bases or a lot of the out-of-the-way places where we go. And your self-identity doesn't come from being a soldier when everyone around you is. It comes from more specific things, whether it's, most of which have nothing to do with the military. On my last team, we had the old man, who was 46 and had to put up with jokes about how the war against the dinosaurs went. We had the country boy who grew up in Iowa in a town of 200 or 300 people. And we had the dude from Brooklyn who boxed and obsessed about how the Yankees were doing. Now, when you leave, all of those things get turned on their head. Especially if you go back home or near home like a lot of our veterans do, your identity changes, and all of a sudden something you'd never exclusively defined yourself as comes in a large way to define you. When the country boy goes back to Iowa, he's not the country boy anymore, he's the veteran. That's how he's seen by his community, and that's true for the dude from Brooklyn or for me or for anyone else. And no matter how often we'd heard during our time in the military about how small the percentage of Americans was that actually served in Iraq and Afghanistan, nothing really prepares you for how small that community actually is. And you quickly learn that just because society respects the values of the military doesn't mean it's always able to exhibit them. And I think if anything, we gain a lot of respect as veterans because of how rare those values can be in day-to-day life. Now, the Army has a list of 7 values that are a core part of basic training. I'm not going to go through them all. And they're presented to you over and over again during that basic training period until, honestly, you start to roll your eyes a little bit when you hear the list again or you see a poster with someone staring off into the distance in duty written over top of it dramatically. So it kind of surprised me where after that 9-week stint, the talk of Army values more or less disappears. There's one part of your annual evaluation form that lists the Army values, but that's the part that always gets automatically checked yes unless you have really, really screwed up, like committed a crime screwed up. But everyone just goes right down the list and checks yes for each of those values. You don't really think about or talk about them anymore. Only now, having left the Army, do I really appreciate how they changed my worldview. And ironically enough, I am violating one of the biggest unspoken values of the Army by giving this speech. Now, I don't want to generalize too broadly, either about the Army, the military, or the rest of society. I saw my fair share of worthless, lazy, no-good soldiers, and a uniform is not some magical piece of cloth which transforms whoever wears it into some kind of superhero. One bad leader in the military can poison an organization just as much as anywhere else. And also, outside the military, I have met plenty of people who lived up to these values that we talked about in the military, whether they were in law enforcement or any other kind of demanding job. So, when I say these things are true about my time in the Army, I don't mean to imply that they were exclusively true for the military, or even that they were always true while I was in. But I am speaking of the military at its best, which it often is, and specifically my experience with an airborne infantry unit. And at our best, we are direct. We are not fragile. We are not passive-aggressive. We say what's on our minds and get it out of our system and move on with our lives. We are not frozen in the face of stress. We make a decision, we learn from it, and we make better decisions as we move forward. We execute a good plan today instead of waiting for a perfect one to show up eventually. And perhaps the best thing about the military is we do not self-promote. Now you may be wondering, how can I talk about how great the Army is? One of the best things about it is that we don't talk about how great we are. All right? And to me, that contradiction is really at the heart of the challenge of becoming a veteran. It's not really in a soldier or service member's nature to talk about yourself. Most soldiers work in small teams, and if you are really good at what you do, people will notice. You do not need to do some kind of sales job. It'll be obvious. It's a great way to live, and it is terrible, terrible preparation for a job interview. Or for that matter, for being asked questions by anyone about the military, even when they're just genuinely curious. Soon after leaving active duty in February, I worked with a group called Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America on an annual advocacy campaign called Storm the Hill. And IAVA, as the group is called, has over 200,000 members, both veterans and supporters. And each year they bring 30 of those veterans to Capitol Hill to talk with congressmen and senators about some legislation that's coming up that would help us out. Now, this year's group ranged from young Army medics to older Navy fighter pilots. And it was our job to put a human face on the issues that affect the entire veteran community. And obviously that meant we had to talk about ourselves, and it was an adjustment. And it really shouldn't be strange to talk about doing something you've done for years. But the idea of walking around kind of advertising your status as a veteran felt very, very strange. But when you only have a half an hour or maybe a half a minute with a busy member of Congress, you have to get right to the point. You do not have the time to let the lessons sink in. And the same is true with job interviews. The level of responsibility that even a junior leader has in the military has no comparison in the outside world, none. But because of that, you have to take the time to explain to people what you did and what you learned from it. And from my experience in the military, you're almost never forced to make a quick moment impression on someone. Even the Army's most elite opportunities usually give you a chance to fully prove yourself before passing judgment on you. You want to be a Green Beret? Pass a basic fitness test, pass a physical, sign some paperwork, and off you go. You get 18 days or something like that, they keep changing it, of assessment outside of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I mean, you're evaluated over a wide spectrum of things and over a fairly long period of time. And even our promotion boards, where a soldier must stand in front of their leadership and display knowledge and bearing under pressure, it includes a group of leaders, at least one of which knows you, because you have to get recommended to go in front of that promotion board. It doesn't just happen. So somebody on there already knows you. And not only do we not talk ourselves up in the military, we don't talk up what we do either. I mean, when you come back from a difficult mission, the most important thing is that you came back. Your instinct is to downplay how difficult it was, because somewhere, deep down inside, you know that either right now or in years prior, somebody else had it worse and they were not complaining about it. And I think the Army, personally, whenever they get tired of the Army Strong slogan, should replace it with, "It could be worse." Because there really is an acute awareness amongst veterans that whether it's somebody in the next valley over, the next village over, or somebody from conflicts past, no matter how difficult you have it, it is not the most difficult thing the U.S. military has ever done. And when I returned from my first deployment to Iraq, when I got back in late 2006, my flight landed in Bangor, Maine. It was our first stop back in America, and we got off the plane and were given a rousing welcome by the Maine Troop Greeters, which is a volunteer group of men and women who have greeted over 1.3 million service members. Anytime, day or night, a plane comes in, they're there. Over 1.3 million service members who are returning to America since 2003. And first among these greeters when we got off the plane were veterans from World War II and Korea and Vietnam. I want to stop for a second. I want to ask any veteran of a conflict from before 9/11, please stand up and take a moment so we can recognize you. Even if you're still in. Thank you. Now, nothing makes you reflect on how good you had it in Baghdad like realizing you could have been on Omaha Beach instead. And all I could think about that day when we got back was that I should be greeting these guys. Every morning when they go out to get their morning paper or go to work, I should be greeting them. So should the rest of the damn country. They fought against entire industrialized nations in dense, sweltering jungles. But when I talked with them, all they could talk about was how tough it must have been for us. How when they fought, they at least fought against an enemy who wore a uniform and on some level obeyed a set of rules. And it was an amazing to see them thinking about us even as we were doing the same for them. Now, our generation of veterans occupies a unique position. There just aren't enough of us to constitute a critical mass in society like there was after World War II. We're a far smaller, far less visible group. But we have come back to a changed America, one that I feel has a powerful collective guilt, justified, over the terrible treatment of our Vietnam veterans. And it took great sacrifices by that generation of Vietnam veterans, but people have finally learned to take out any frustration they have about a war on the people who started it and not the people who are fighting it. If anything, today, I feel like we're treated with extra respect by those who feel like we're bearing the consequences of a bad political decision. And the gratitude America shows towards its veterans today is an amazing and humbling thing. Now, while I was stationed in Europe, I had a lot of chances to travel, and I took them because I knew I wouldn't be living there forever. And I always believed in being honest about what I did for a living whenever anyone asked me. I wouldn't really bring it up on my own, but if I was asked, I would answer honestly. And I understood why many of my fellow soldiers didn't. Excuse me. As relatively uncommon as veterans are in America, we are almost mythological to the average European. So if you acknowledge you're an American soldier in polite conversation, you are immediately elected spokesman for all American soldiers everywhere. And honestly, who wants their vacation to turn into a long discussion about their day job? But believe it or not, I was always pleasantly surprised by the results of these conversations. I was never asked for lurid details, and very, very rarely was I asked to defend our foreign policy or the parts of it that they disagreed with. I did get a lot of questions about why we had military bases in Italy still. People seemed to know that we were in Germany, but be surprised we were in Italy. To which I replied with some variation of, well, it's a trade. You give us a little bit of land and we do a lot of the fighting. What I almost never heard about, though, no matter where I went or who I spoke with, were other countries' veterans. Now, there are some good reasons for this, depending on the country. The dark side of patriotism is nationalism. And it's an ugly force which is an all too recent memory in many places in Europe. And its cities are dotted with reminders of what can happen when a military is deployed in the service of evil. But even in countries since that time have had veterans die. In Iraq and Afghanistan, I heard and saw almost nothing about their sacrifice. And in my occasional chats with soldiers from other countries, they were always blown away by the respect and love shown by the American people towards its military. And I can only imagine on their behalf, having to give up everything that the military lifestyle demands of you, only to be greeted with, at best, lukewarm enthusiasm. So I want to take a moment and say thank you to everyone who helps form that culture of appreciation here in America. One which is noticed not just by our veterans, but by veterans all over the world. Without the support of non-veterans, we wouldn't have the USO, which helps soldiers stay comfortable as we travel across the country or across the world. We certainly wouldn't have the new GI Bill, which has allowed me and nearly 750,000 other veterans to attend schools which may have otherwise been out of reach. And we certainly wouldn't have Operation Flag the Lawn or events like tonight. Now, I've been able to run on the outfield grass at Nationals Park and meet with officials in the White House and do an amazing number of meaningful things because of the support of non-veterans and how our country treats us. So it may surprise you to know that when I asked one fellow law student and fellow veteran whether he'd be attending tonight's dinner, he said no. He'd heard we'd be paired up with non-veterans. He didn't want to be subject to what he thought might become an uncomfortable Q&A. And another law student said that another law student had already asked him what has become the poster child for dumb things to ask a veteran: did you kill anybody? And just like I understood why soldiers traveling in Europe sometimes hid their careers, I understand why veterans may skip these kinds of events. It can seem truly ungrateful to not answer people's questions after the tremendous support we've been shown in America. So the safer choice is not to go. And for the reasons I mentioned, we don't generally try to be the center of attention, whether that means being praised or being worried about. But we can't expect society to understand us and what we have to offer if we avoid conversations about our military experience. Not when the unemployment rate for veterans is higher than an already high national average, and the Department of Veterans Affairs is overtaxed and struggles to provide even basic medical and financial benefits that people have earned. We need to shape these conversations about our military experience, especially when the vast majority of them are pleasant, worthwhile experiences anyway. We have to understand that our country's pride in us will result in a lot of attention because of what we represent. And with that attention comes the occasional awkward question, but even those questions are almost always asked with good intentions. We need to help those who support us understand the best way to do so, and this may require some adjustment from both veterans and our supporters, but an open conversation is the only way forward. And for veterans, it's an easy thing to get caught in a trap where you need people, whether it's friends, family, employers, to understand how the military shaped you, but you don't want to be limited to or defined only by something you've already done. It's like watching a celebrity gets interviewed, somebody who's famous but not quite as famous as they used to be, and they only get asked about their past success instead of whatever project they're excited about now or working on trying to get attention for. I always feel kind of bad for them. And even the best things you've ever done eventually need to become the backdrop for something new. So, in my opinion, and please, the veteran community is not a homogenous one. So, I know there's folks out there that may have their own approach to this. But for me, the best way, I think, to appreciate a veteran is to ask them about their future. What are we studying in school? What are we looking forward to doing with it? Are we already working? Are we going to start a business, start a family? And once you've heard about our present and our future, then ask about our military past and how it will help us achieve those new goals or how it inspired us to help choose them in the first place. And don't assume personality traits which are associated with the Army necessarily came from the Army. I am a lot more direct than anyone else I know at the law school. It makes people uncomfortable sometimes. And everyone assumes the Army made me this way. In reality, the Army actually helped me be more subtle and to work better. Hard to believe, I know. But it helped me learn to work better with different personality types. I met people I would have never met had I not joined the Army. I was unlikely to go to the middle of Iowa and to learn about their values and their culture, the way they approach life. And the Army brought all those people to me. I mean, my slightly crazy vet buddies were all slightly crazy before they joined the Army. The Army just gave them a place where slightly crazy is often the right way to be. The military does not wipe away your personality and create something from scratch. It just improves who you already were. So, don't go thinking we're hiding something if we don't tell you a dramatic story. A quiet veteran may just be a quiet guy who joined the military. Doesn't mean he's got problems or PTSD. Even the friends of mine who do have PTSD wouldn't trade their time in the military for anything, and they are doing just fine in the civilian world. Many of us have seen the extreme limits of human behavior, and what we learn in doing so is not always fit for polite dinner table conversation. Understand that someone's time in the military may include both the best and worst moments of their lives, but that the best ones are a lot more interesting to hear about. The military is, without a doubt, the funniest place I have ever worked in my entire life, and I enjoy sharing that part of the experience with people who usually only hear about the dramatic parts of the job. We have a much better time doing a much tougher job than the vast majority of people out there. Now, how do we pull that off? That's a subject worth engaging a veteran on. I will give you a few hints from my perspective. We've learned what's worth worrying about and what's not. We cuss a lot more than most people and worry about formality a lot less, because we know that being formal and being professional are not the same thing. We know that getting rained on or snowed on or covered in mud is not the end of the world. We do spend so much time around each other that we generally don't bother pretending to be something we're not, because everyone's going to figure it out anyway. When you live in a tent with someone, even a relatively big tent, there's no hiding your true self. We are often deprived of all the usual coping mechanisms that people use. No family, no spouses, no bars, no clubs, no beaches, no golf courses, no TV. So we learn to adjust to damn near anything. And after spending years in the military, the last and biggest adjustment demanded of us is the one back to civilian life, to becoming a veteran. Now, that transition will mean something different to every person that goes through it. I was fortunate enough to work as a national security fellow for Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia as my first job after I left the military. And our acting chief of staff she was also a former paratrooper, and I worked with another national security fellow who was a current active duty Army captain, and he was assigned to the Senate for a year. And both of them made my transition a lot smoother than it could have been otherwise. And I've been honored to work with IAVA and to join their efforts advocating on behalf of veterans, and to work in the Senate on a campaign designed to recognize those businesses and other organizations that hire our veterans. I've also enjoyed new challenges, though, ones that had nothing to do with the military at all, and which taught me how to start applying the skills that I learned in the military environment to new and different challenges. And to me, that's the ultimate lesson in becoming a veteran. You will always be connected to the military, and that relationship may be a complex and multifaceted thing. It will not always be something that's easy to translate to people who weren't there with you. But this isn't a challenge that's unique to the military. Even within the military, people in different jobs or units can belong to completely different cultures. Differences within the military can be just as great as between the military and the civilian world. Bridging those gaps in the military or afterwards is an incredibly important job. So the answer, to me, if you're a supporter, is to understand that while we are absolutely proud of our service, it is a part of a larger whole. And if you're a veteran, it is best to be honest and open about your experience so that other people can begin to understand how it shaped us, the lessons it taught us, and how valuable those lessons might be to the rest of American society. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Just a round of applause.